we got a cue from our important people behind the scenes that we can get started. So everything is in order. So welcome everybody to coming to this side event on clarifying norms in conservation and human rights. My name is Su Young-hwan. I'm with the UN Environment Program, working on human rights and other environmental governance issues. So let me just share a little bit more about why we are actually having this meeting, and also what we have done so far before I introduce the great speakers that we have today. So first of all, why we're doing this, why we're working on conservation and human rights. And as everybody knows, environmental crises are a human rights crisis. And on environmental issues, we have climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, and pollution crisis. And among others, conservation is an area that is less known, and which requires also a lot more attention on human rights, and it's an area that requires attention, and also the human rights can benefit a lot of people working in the conservation areas. And there is also quite a lot of troubling relationship in the conservation, and also people living around the protected areas, and also indigenous peoples. And in some cases, a lot of protected areas are designated without the proper consultation with indigenous peoples or the people who are living around this area. And also, the governments have parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. They've committed themselves to declare their 30% of their territories and oceans as a protected area by 2030. So we have this opportunity to have protect more biological diversity, but we also have an opportunity to promote and respect human rights in the conservation area. And change in this conservation is needed to respect human rights more, and also to address past issues, also prevent any future human rights violations or abuses. And so with this, we have the UNEP has worked on this area with Professor John Knox sitting next to me, and many others, including Forest Peoples Program, who played a key role in the beginning of the conceptualizing, and also having a consultation with the indigenous peoples and other rights holders. And we've had 2 consultations last year on this issue about developing human rights guidance and human rights principles on conservation. And one is for conservation organizations, and the other is for funders. And what we have learned from this process is that there's a dire need for this. And this is coming from all stakeholders, including funders, conservation organizations, indigenous peoples, and the communities, and who are actually part of also organizing this meeting. As you've seen in the flyers, there are a lot of co-sponsors to this meeting, and they dire need for clear guidance and solid principles and standards based on human rights law and principles, human rights and law and norms, and with the specific guidance that tells you what to do and what not to do. So that's not at the principle level on human rights, but also is really specific to the conservation area on and giving a clear guidance. And what also came out of these meetings and the consultations is that we need to implement this, the guidances and human rights in the conservation area and in our conservation efforts, and also to have regular meetings on the designated to discuss conservation and human rights issues, because we see a lot of ad hoc meetings, including this side event. It's not a regular one that will continue having this meeting, and there's a lot of call for this having a regular forum to discuss the human rights and the conservation issues, to monitor, review, and also to discuss compliance, and to promote dialogues among different stakeholders. And lastly, what we have learned is there's a momentum for this. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of stakeholders. They are really welcoming this initiative and wanting to implement it. So we have gathered that, okay, this is a right moment to actually really push for the conservation human rights principles in the area of conservation, and work with all stakeholders. So this is where we are, and we're organizing. We have organized this meeting with a lot of co-sponsors to have a general discussion about conservation and human rights, but also to have to share what we have done so far, and also have your feedback on what we have done and how we can move forward with all stakeholders on this issue. So without further ado, I will be introducing our speakers for this event. So I have to my right, I have John Nooks, a professor of law in the Wake Forest University, and he's well known at the Human Rights Council. Like, he's a former special rapporteur on human rights and the environment. And to my right, we have David Boyd, the current special rapporteur on human rights and the environment. And to my far right, we have Patricia Umpeta Umnyama. She's a director in human rights and conservation from the Nature Conservancy, and it's really, really great to have actually the conservation organization having a director on human rights and then also participating in this meeting. And we do have also like 4 other like video speakers who couldn't be here unfortunately, but he's joining us through a video message. So without further ado, I will go ahead with ask Professor John Nooks to actually tell us more about what we have done. And I have some specific questions for John. So John, you're commissioned by UNEP to prepare a draft human rights principles for conservation. Can you tell us about some conservation practices that requires attention, and also tell us about the draft principles that you prepared that addresses these issues?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Soo-Young, very much for that introduction and for those questions. It's a pleasure to be back here at the Palais. It's a little disturbing that the escalators no longer work since I've stopped being the special rapporteur. David, maybe you could look at that while you're before your term is up. Anyway, so as Soo-Young just said, UNEP has been working on developing human rights principles on conservation and asked me to help prepare draft principles for discussion. A little bit more on the background here. I think, as Soo-Young said, it's well understood that the world is facing a global biodiversity crisis, but I think it's less well understood in most of the world, maybe not in the Palais, but in most of the world, it's less well understood that that global biodiversity crisis is also a human rights crisis. It's a human rights crisis for all of us because the loss of global biodiversity drastically interferes with everyone everywhere's rights to life and health and their right to a healthy environment and many other human rights. But it's a especially catastrophic threat for indigenous peoples and others who live directly in the natural ecosystems that are most at risk of being destroyed. They are the ones who are on the front lines in defending those ecosystems, and they are the ones who are bearing a disproportionate cost. Of the 1,733 environmental defenders who were killed because of their work between 2012 and 2022, more than 1/3 were indigenous peoples, despite the fact that indigenous peoples make up only about 5% of the global population. So it might seem obvious that the people who are on the front lines are protecting the natural environment from destruction by mining companies, by logging, from illegal poaching, that it would make sense to protect them first, to protect their rights. However, historically, and by historically I mean for over a century and really throughout the 20th century, the ideal of international conservation was fortress conservation. The ideal was that you would best protect the environment by setting aside protected areas free of any permanent human population. And in the pursuit of that vision, which was largely driven by colonial powers imposing this vision on places in the global south, at least at first, in pursuit of that vision, literally tens of millions of indigenous peoples and others were displaced, often violently, from their ancestral lands. In 2003, the international conservation community came together to say fortress conservation is no more. We reject the idea of fortress conservation. Instead, we will respect the human rights of indigenous peoples and others, and we will pursue inclusive conservation on the basis of partnership with them instead of treating them as the enemy or as part of the problem. The problem today, therefore, is not so much what the norms should be, it's implementation of those norms. The conservation community has accepted the idea that they should be complying with human rights, but there's still an enormous gap between that acceptance in principle and the practice of conservation, which in many parts of the world today continues to be based on a kind of fortress conservation mentality. In 2016, Vicky Talley-Corpuz, who was then the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples, wrote a really groundbreaking report on conservation and human rights, in which she noted that since 2001, she and her predecessors in that mandate had received numerous allegations of large-scale violations of the rights of Indigenous peoples in the context of conservation measures. In 2022, the current Special Rapporteur on Indigenous peoples, on the rights of Indigenous peoples, Jose Francisco Calizay, reported that, quote, Indigenous peoples across the globe have overall not seen a concrete improvement in the realization of their rights in the context of conservation since the 2016 report by Vicky Talley-Corpuz. He stated that the exclusionary approach to protecting biodiversity known as fortress conservation continues to prevail and has led to violent evictions, militarized violence, and the disposition of the lands of Indigenous peoples, who are, again, the best stewards of nature. As Su Young said, this is a particularly important issue to address now because of the decision in 2022 by the parties to the Biodiversity Convention in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework to set aside 30% of the entire globe, the land and the oceans, as protected areas by 2030. This 30 by 30 target is enormously ambitious. It would essentially more than double the amount of protected areas in the world in less than a decade. Indigenous peoples and others are understandably worried that this might take place at their expense, as so much of the history of international conservation has unfortunately taken place at their expense. So the UNEP proposal, the UNEP project here, is to try and clarify, to make clearer how exactly the human rights framework applies. One of the problems historically has been that some of the major actors in conservation are non-state actors. That is, they're big conservation organizations and big conservation funders. So what norms apply to them? The short answer to that question is that in recent years, in the last 20 years, human rights law has done actually quite a bit to clarify how human rights norms apply to major non-state actors. The most obvious source with respect to the big conservation organizations are the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, developed by John Ruggie and then endorsed by the Human Rights Council in 2011. Some oversight mechanisms have already taken those principles and applied them to conservation organizations such as World Wildlife Fund. So in fulfilling this mandate from UNEP, I didn't try and invent these norms from scratch. Instead, all I really did was take the norms that had already been developed and explain how they could be applied to conservation organizations, taking into account the UN Guiding Principles and also, of course, international human rights norms such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I won't go through all of these core human rights principles that apply to conservation organizations and conservation funders, but let me just briefly say that they would include a requirement to undertake human rights due diligence. They would include the requirement to engage in meaningful consultation with all affected stakeholders, abiding in particular by the requirement that before undertaking or supporting actions that would adversely affect Indigenous peoples, they have to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of those Indigenous peoples. They would have to, just as the UN Guiding Principles require for business, they would have to be clear that they are under an obligation to prevent or cease any adverse human rights impacts that they either are responsible for or cause directly or contribute to. And with respect to impacts that they're directly linked to, they would have to use all their leverage to try and prevent those impacts from occurring. They would have to provide for effective remedies for the adverse impacts that they do cause. They would have to report publicly and regularly on what they're doing so that people are able to see how well these human rights principles are actually being effectively implemented. And then finally, they would have to be especially careful when providing support to law enforcement. A lot of the human rights violations in this area have occurred essentially as the result of abuses by rangers, park rangers, acting as law enforcement in pursuit of poachers or other local laws, national laws, abusing their privileges in law enforcement by murdering, raping, torturing, and otherwise abusing indigenous peoples and others. So for conservation organizations, before they would ever support law enforcement, they would have additional requirements they would have to meet. For conservation funders, briefly, they would be required to make sure that any recipients of their funding have appropriate safeguards in place to prevent these kinds of abuses and to respond effectively if they do. And funders would have to have mechanisms in place to restrict or terminate funding if it turns out that despite those protections, abuses nevertheless occur. As Sue Young said, we've already had 2 meetings on this in the fall. We've undertaken a number of consultations. We're going to have a third in April in New York, at which a lot of participants from the conservation community will be present, and we hope to finalize these principles and be able to launch them well in advance of the October Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So that's where that all stands. Thanks again for coming today, and I'm going to turn it over now to the next speaker. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, John. And I know you have a lot of questions, all positive feedback, but could you hold on? And we'll collect all the questions towards the end of the presentation, and then have a Q&A session. So I'm going to turn on to the speakers who sent the video messages. We have 2 speakers, Joanne Carling. She's also very well known to a lot of you, indigenous activist from the Philippines, and she's also the winner of the UNEP's Champion of the Earth Award in 2018, and she's currently the executive director of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International. And the second speaker is Mali Ole Kaunga. He's the founder and the executive director of the Indigenous Movement for Peace Advancement and Conflict Transformation called Impact. And so the 2 speakers will tell us more about their indigenous people's perspective about conservation.
Allow me to greet you with Happy International Women's Day today. Let us all commemorate the great sacrifices, courage, and leadership of women environmental defenders across the globe who continue to put their lives at risk to save our future. I am grateful to be part of this important conversation, clarifying norms in conservation and human rights. Conservation efforts have both positive and negative impacts to indigenous peoples. On one hand, building collaboration and partnership with indigenous peoples based on the respect for our rights and well-being have yielded positive results because it is based on recognizing our roles and contributions as stewards of nature. On the other hand, fortress conservation, based on the colonial approach of separating nature from people, has been highly problematic. This approach is directly in conflict with our values and principles in sustaining reciprocal relations and in living in harmony with nature. Since the introduction of fortress conservation, it has resulted to the forced evictions and displacements of thousands of indigenous peoples in many countries, which is a clear violation of our rights to our lands, territories, and resources. This approach does not only violate our right to our traditional occupations and livelihoods, it has in fact resulted to our criminalization when we practice these activities, such as hunting, fishing, gathering of forest products, among others, and it has resulted to the incarceration of hundreds of indigenous peoples with hardly any access to justice. It has also resulted to the systemic abuse and violence against Indigenous women by security guards of national parks and conservation areas. While many conservation organizations claim that forest conservation is already a thing of the past and they are committed to human rights-based approach to conservation, this commitment needs to be put in practice to allow genuine collaboration and partnerships with Indigenous peoples. It is important to fully understand what a human rights-based approach to conservation really means on the ground and to know and establish the key institutional steps to put this commitment into action, especially in the face of the implementation of the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework and for effective solutions to the climate crisis. From the perspective of Indigenous peoples, norms and standards on human rights-based approach shall include a specific recognition and acknowledgement of the critical roles and contributions of Indigenous peoples and the need to respect and protect our rights as essential and necessary. This means it requires clear policies and guidelines on the recognition, protection, and respect of Indigenous peoples' rights in general, and in particular, to our rights to our lands, territories, and resources, to our free, prior, and informed consent, to the respect for our traditional livelihoods and sustainable resource management systems, to the practice of our traditional knowledge and values, and of cooperation and living in harmony with nature. It also requires cultural sensitivity by understanding and integrating our cultural values and practices to enhance collaboration. It is also an obligation to ensure that effective participation of Indigenous peoples in decision-making processes concerning conservation efforts by establishing effective mechanisms for long-term and sustained engagement with Indigenous peoples. Further, the establishment of effective redress and accountability mechanisms accessible to Indigenous peoples, including by Indigenous women, is necessary. We need to put a stop to the violations of Indigenous peoples' rights by holding states and conservation organizations accountable. Thus, we welcome the initiative on clarifying norms in conservation and human rights as urgent and imperative in order to transform the current unjust approach to conservation that is inherently disrespectful of the rights of Indigenous peoples. Thank you. Allow me to greet you with
My name is Mali Olekaunga. I'm the Director of Impact, but I'm also a facilitator to the Pan-African Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities Alliance, which is created to actually create space for Indigenous peoples and local communities to really build their voice around conservation and issues to do with rights and right to lands. I appreciate being here, sharing my own perspectives as you attend the side event on the sidelines of the 55th session of the Human Rights Council. The impact of conservation of human rights and also land rights to Indigenous peoples and to some extent also local community at a alarming level. We've seen a number of people being displaced, their rights being abused, but also arbitrary arrests for being found in these, what they call protected areas. We also see a number of emerging policies, global policies, such as the Global Biodiversity Framework, where 30 by 30 is becoming a big issue because it means more and more people, Indigenous people, will be displaced if the issues to do with land rights are not respected and recognized. I think the Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, Francisco Cali, has done both thematic reports around issues about indigenous peoples' rights in relation to conservation. And I think also the human rights norms around conservation issues and also around funding organizations being developed by UNEP are very important. We need to see conservation organizations and funders respect indigenous people's rights and also integrate those rights into their own policy documents. We need them to see those organizations do due diligence so that to see and how mechanisms to address human rights of indigenous peoples that are potentially to be abused by creating of new conservation areas or protected areas. And also we need to see more robust focus and support for indigenous peoples and local community organizations being supported to undertake their own conservation according to their own indigenous visions and also livelihoods. It is very imperative that organizations also dealing with the conservation and or conservation funding agencies to respect the customary and traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples. They have for many years contributed to conservation and biodiversity in their own ways and means. It's very also important to have more dialogue on these issues at national levels and ensure that national biodiversity adaptation plans or what kind of mechanism countries have to address human-wildlife conflicts that are increasing in many countries, including Kenya. So I would really like to see that the Human Rights Council in future take strong measures to ensure that human rights abuses in relation to conservation is being addressed at the country level. Thanks so much.
Person. So we heard from Joanne and Mali about their perspective from the indigenous site defender and also like indigenous person who is working in a conservation area. So I'm going to turn now to Patricia. And Patricia, we heard so much about like we heard from Joanne and Mali about the right to like participation at peak and also the land issues and traditional knowledge and the management of resources. And we understand that several conservation organizations, such including the Nature Conservancy, has taken initiatives on human rights. And I have two questions. One is, could you tell us could you tell us what the right space approach means to you? And second is, so we understand that human rights may not be a new issue for many conservation organizations, including for TNC, but could you tell us how do you assess the value of our initiative and the draft principles that UNEP and John are preparing? And can you see any tangible results or differences this initiative can make? Over to you.
Thank you, Sue. Okay, all right.
It's on now. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Su Yang. Greetings, colleagues and friends. As Su Yang mentioned, I'm Patricia. I'm with the Nature Conservancy. And I've been working in community conservation for close to a decade. Sorry, 2 decades. I'm getting old. So it's almost a generation. And I thought I could address this aspect around human rights and my own journey, and also the journey that has been a transition in the Nature Conservancy, where I've done quite a bit of this work mostly in Africa with indigenous people and local communities. And I'd love to share a story around my own journey to kind of put it in perspective. So about 30 years ago, as a young Zambian, I'm from Zambia, I took a school trip to one of Zambia's largest national park, the Kafue National Park. And today we heard about fortress conservation. That park is one which is also a park that was developed in the 50s, and people were taken out of the park. I went to this park for the first time in '85 as an 11-year-old for a school trip. And I remember very vividly, after a long day of travel, we arrived at this national park, a group of about 20 of us kids who'd never been to a national park or in nature, I remember seeing rhinos in the horizon and vividly seeing a whole bustle of rhinos running around. And it was a great sight. Of course, we enjoyed the school trip. Little did I know that at that point, Zambia had a poaching crisis. At the point in the 80s, Zambia had the third largest rhino population, about 18,000. So in that experience, I was able to experience one of the last rhinos in the wild in Zambia. Zambia lost its rhino population to a point of extinction. Today, as I speak, we're reintroducing rhinos. So why do I share the story of rhinos? The story of rhinos is really very closely intertwined with the loss of indigenous and local community rights and stewardship in a lot of our landscapes and areas, especially in the global south where I come from. The models, as we've heard today, in the 80s and 90s, which were fortress conservation, took people's rights away. The rights for people to self-determine their role, their space in protecting these lands they've stewarded for many years. So when I think about human rights, I really think about how human rights are really strongly intertwined with biodiversity, but they are also very intertwined to what we see today as a climate crisis. The ability to have people self-determine their space in this and taking it away has really created this crisis. So with human rights, we really have to position it at the center of our conservation work. And so to the second question, Suyang, so after working for 2 decades in the position as African IPL, Indigenous People and Local Community Strategy Director, where I had the charge of helping the Conservancy develop partnership with Indigenous people and local communities in Africa, I took on this new role at the Conservancy as Global Director of Human Rights in Conservation. It's a new role, and it's the first time the Conservancy has created an Office of Human Rights, and we had a foundational policy that was initiated in 2022 by our global board, which is our Respecting Human Rights policy. So what this did is it laid the framework of how we as an international conservation organization will ensure we are respecting the rights of indigenous people and local communities. It has it's been built on 4 foundational UN human rights instruments. So the UN Declaration of 1948, the UN Guiding Principles, which John has mentioned, the United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and the ILO standards as well. So we're using these as the building blocks of how we as an international conservation ensure we do no harm and ultimately do good in the work we do. Part of my charge, and I think it builds off what we're talking about, clarifying the norms, is really like, how does this work translate on a day-to-day basis in our work? And so I've been part of the team that's also been thinking around this and putting it into practice in our organization. And a few aspects I'd love to raise is the element around hiring staff that actually are dedicated to ensuring that we are integrating human rights principles and practices in our conservation work and our priorities. So in my office, we are hiring skill sets we've not ordinarily had, which are human rights experts to help us, to help conservation staff do work that does do no harm and continues to do good. We have unpacking 4 key pillars, which build off some of the clarifying norms. So developing a human rights due diligence framework for the organization. This really will be able to identify human rights risks early, assess, and mitigate, communicate. We're also focusing on really thinking around how we partner with indigenous people and local communities under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and other rights holders. We're beginning to explore the opportunities around developing a grievance redress mechanism at the organizational level. And then finally, we've got a unit that is now beginning to think around the minimum performance standards for ensuring safeguards are in place. And these are safeguards that are really based and integrated from a human rights perspective. I think those kind of are my comments, and I hope I've been able to lay some groundwork there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Patricia. I think she actually responds to like what I said in the beginning, that there's a momentum actually to really move on with the human rights norms in the conservation area. So it's really good to hear about like TNC's own initiatives responding to all the issues that we also in Joanne and Mali have raised. So now I'll turn to two other speakers who sent the video messages. And the first one is Astrid Puentes. She's an international expert on human rights and environment, and she's also a former executive director of the Inter-American Association for Environmental Defense, also known as IDA. And also our second speaker is Meg Caldwell. She's an ocean director from the Packard Foundation, which is a private foundation. And then also you will see about their perspective on how they see as a funder's role in the conservation and human rights area. So could we have Astrid?
Thank you for the invitation to contribute to this very important workshop. Over the years and all over the world, unfortunately, we have seen how conservation efforts have also violated the rights of indigenous peoples and of other communities that are based, live, and own a lot of these areas. This because of the ignorance of what are the human rights laws that apply, or because of the premise that nature is better without any human being around. However, and as Western science today's evidence, 80% of biodiversity that we need and want to protect is actually being guarded and protected by indigenous peoples and a lot of those communities. And in addition to this, the role of women and girls in these communities and in these conservation efforts has been absolutely key. Therefore, finding ways to stop, remediate, and find other models to conserve biodiversity is essential. And today, the human rights guidelines for the conservation organizations can be a key tool for clarifying, advancing, and hopefully also remedying a lot of the human rights violations that conservation efforts have caused. Today, we need urgently to solve the multiple planetary crises, and guidelines such as the ones that we're seeing today for human rights for conservation organizations can be a great tool for these advancements. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Meg Caldwell. I'm the Ocean Director for the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. We're located on the west coast of the United States in California. And I'd like to thank the UN Human Rights Council and the UN Environment Program for giving us the opportunity to speak to the importance of aligning around norms for conservation and human rights from a funder's perspective. The Packard Foundation has been supporting work to advance the integrity and health of our environment over the last 60 years. More broadly, we work with and support people and communities to create durable and equitable solutions for a healthy, resilient, natural world where both people and nature flourish. To achieve this vision, it's vitally important to protect and uphold human rights in conservation work, not just because funders and conservation implementers are duty bearers under international law and standards, but also because the global biodiversity crisis is also a human rights crisis, especially for those people and communities who rely on healthy ecosystems for food, livelihoods, and cultural heritage. We believe that durable conservation solutions are best achieved when those solutions proactively protect and advance the needs, aspirations, and rights of people and communities who are most directly affected. As the world's largest philanthropic funder for ocean science and conservation, we understand how important it is to show leadership at the intersection of planetary health and human well-being, We're honored to be working with the UN Environment Program, human rights experts, other conservation funders, and conservation implementers in clarifying norms for conservation and human rights. Thank you for your attention to this important work.
So now I'll turn to, I'm getting conscious of the time, so I'll turn to our last speaker, David Boyd. And David, I have questions for you. So we have heard from like various speakers on the importance of like clarifying human rights norms in conservation. And could you share some reflections on what we heard today, and also tell us about what will be your recommendation going forward in advancing human rights in the conservation? Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Sue Young, and thanks for the opportunity. I've really learned a lot by listening to the various speakers today, and I'll just be very brief so that we have maybe a few minutes for questions. I think it's important to recognize that the science is now crystal clear that the best way to protect biological diversity is to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples and other traditional place-based communities. That's crystal clear, and there are terrific examples from around the world of rights-based conservation taking place. There are indigenous-led protected areas in Australia, in Canada, and also very impressive community-based conservation efforts in places like Namibia and Botswana in Africa. And I think we really need to learn from those good practices and teach them to other parts of the world as well. The second thing that I want to be perfectly clear on, and this reiterates what John and Patricia has said, is that rights-based conservation is an obligation, not an option. It's fundamentally important to recognize that. It's not a luxury, it's not the icing on the cake, it's the way all conservation action should be implemented going forward. And I think that the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that was negotiated a couple of years ago, when the first draft came out, it made no mention of human rights, no mention of indigenous people's rights. And the final version of that Global Biodiversity Framework is actually very strong on human rights. Multiple references to indigenous people's rights, a reference to the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, reference to the rights of women and girls in conservation. And so what we need to really focus on with these guiding principles going forward is making sure that states and conservation organizations, all actors involved in protecting, conserving, and restoring biodiversity, follow the commitments that they have made. And we need to hold states that perpetuate fortress conservation accountable. We need to hold conservation actors that contribute to fortress conservation accountable. And we need to ensure that all actions, as I said, going forward are based with human rights, as Patricia said, human rights really at the center of conservation action. And so I think, you know, these guidelines or principles are really critically important. Getting them out into the world will be vital through meetings of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the World Protected Areas Congress. Love to see it in a resolution, a reference here at the Human Rights Council. And I think that, you know, we are at a critical time in the conservation of biodiversity on Earth. We need to move forward rapidly, but we need to have indigenous people at the forefront of that movement. Thank you.
Very much, David. And now we have about 10 minutes, so we'll open the floor for questions and comments. And I already have one speaker in line, so I will give the floor to IUCN.
Thank you. Really great to be in this event, and thank you so much for your presentations. So my name is Radhika. I work for the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Our headquarters is in Gland, next to Nyon, just down the road. We are an intergovernmental organization with the permanent observer status on the environment to the UN. And it's really great to hear everybody talking about the very issues we are tackling in our membership. We are a union of 1,400 members. TNC is a member. And in 2016, we actually opened a category of membership for IPOs, Indigenous Peoples Organizations. And in 2021, so we have our Congress every 4 years, they were able to vote in Marseille alongside their governments and other international and national organizations that work in conservation. Now, this this category of membership and this work is rocking the conservation community in good and not so good ways. It's unsettling for some, and it's also welcoming for some. So for us, it's really a priority to not so much start looking at how we do human rights in conservation ourselves, but to partner with the human rights community to get this right. I think this is such a delicate topic, so it's not so much about building our own capacities. There has to be, you can't be the jury and the judge. There has to be some level of transparency, strong partnership with the human rights community, with the human rights practitioners to really work with us to get things right and to get our members to move on the same path. So very happy to be here and look forward to our meeting and our discussion after this. Thank you.
Radhika, and do we have any questions or comments in the room or online?
This is UNDP speaking. Just maybe to share some reflections from our side. We're very pleased to co-sponsor this event on this important topic, and we welcome the draft set of principles on conservation and human rights presented here today. I would like to congratulate UN Environment and the Special Rapporteurs for the extensive consultations undertaken in 2023. We also recognize and reaffirm the growing emphasis placed on rights-based approaches under the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework adopted by state parties at the CBD COP15 in 2022. And UNDP also notes that further work is being undertaken on the GBF indicators, including on the topic of protected and conserved areas, governance, and decision-making, and support to environmental human rights defenders as part of targets 3, 21, 22, and 23. We reconfirm our commitment to working with UN Environment and OHCHR on the rollout and implementation of the UN guidance to resident coordinators and UNCTs regarding support to environmental defenders. Furthermore, as part of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, UNDP has pledged to operationalize the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in 100 countries by 2030. So we aim to achieve this by integrating the right to a healthy environment into joint programming under the UNDP Nature Pledge, and also through updating and supporting implementation of national biodiversity strategies and action plans in line with the GBF, as well as by assisting civil society organizations, indigenous peoples, and local communities in directly accessing finance. And finally, just to say, within UNDP's mandate on governance and rule of law, we are equally committed to deepen our engagement with the judiciary in ensuring access to environmental justice, expand human rights due diligence processes, as well as supporting national human rights institutions. Thank you very much.
And we look forward to working with IUCN and UNDP and other the partners on this. Do we have anybody? Ben?
Thank you. Ben Schachter, UN Human Rights Office, and we're very glad to be part of this discussion as well. But just a quick question, which would be if you could share a little bit more about next steps in terms of how to get these principles acted upon once they're finalized. Obviously, the drafting is ongoing and the consultative process is ongoing. But what's the plan for rolling it out and ensuring uptake?
I mean, more than one of us could answer that question, I think. I'll just highlight a couple of things. I think one is we're hoping through, again, wide consultations that we've been having with conservation organizations, funders, but also indigenous organizations and other rights-based organizations to have widespread endorsement so that there's a general consensus around these going forward. A lot of, as Patricia says, a lot of conservation organizations and funders are already thinking about this, and some have already, taken serious steps in this direction. I think what would be great is if these norms help shape what they're doing and help clarify what they need to do, but also then provide a kind of standard by which what they're doing could be assessed. I also want to just emphasize what Soo Young said at the outset, that another kind of idea that has come out of this is the idea of a regular forum on conservation and human rights that would meet, and one of the things that it could do is talk about how to address the issue you raised, how to ensure implementation and uptake.
Quickly, another point on this. So our approach is also to get the buy-in from all the stakeholders, including especially indigenous peoples, and to have a bottom-up approach to this issue, because a lot of policies, through the consultation, a lot of indigenous peoples and the communities, they were telling us that, they don't want a, top-down approach to conservation anymore. So they want to have the ownership to this idea and the principles. So we want to have their buy-in, and we also we are getting quite a lot of their endorsement on it. So that's one approach. And so we have still ongoing discussions about this, how to take this forward. And one of the ideas is to actually pilot this principles. So we're having some conversation with the conservation organizations and some others about once this is finalized and we have enough endorsement, what about we pilot this? And this can be also reported to this the forum that we are envisioning, like Forum on Human Rights and Conservation, and keep monitoring and learning from the experience. So.
Just along the lines of the forum, there's also been discussion this week, including with the president of the Human Rights Council, about having a special session this year on the planetary crisis and human rights. And I think it would be critically important to have a component of that special session focused on conservation and human rights, and for sure representation of indigenous peoples.
Thank you, David. So I think we have 1 minute left. So I'll just say thank you, everybody, for participating in this discussion today, and also all speakers and co-sponsors and those who joined us here today and also online, and also our colleagues at Juliana and Richard, and also Diana and Harvey, who made this event possible. And lastly, I want to say Happy International Women's Day, and thank you so much, and we'll be in touch. So this is our start.